Beyond blood and tongue, deconstructing the politics of disillusionment of the hybrid mind of the war criminals led by Abiy Ahmed's Oromo authenticity. This paper critically examines the contested nature of Oromo identity of Abiy Ahmed Ali, who come up to an illegitimate leadership from the backyard of the baptized POWs by TPLFs under the garb clad with the nominal, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, a misnomer and the license of tyrants. They called them People's Democratic Organization, PDOs, numerically prefixed 89 ethnic names incarcerated within the dependent predatory settler colonial Abyssinian Empire to serve as the loyal working horse who fulfilled their master's command since their feet held 𝗕𝗏𝗀 in 1991, without hesitation for solid 28 years of the one-man tyrannical command, post-rule in their corresponding folks' territoriality. The OPDOs, in Oromia, to whom the blasted lair of global reckon and war criminal pariah Abiy Ahmed Ali, among others whose right place must have been in the International Court of Justice, in The Hague if justice is to be prevailed in this wired world. The predatory colonial Abyssinian Empire was conceived as a mirror image of the greedy and resourceless European autocratic states' colonial projects framework of signing treaties between themselves in Berlin to balkanize the Africa's continent. It was called the General Acts of the Treaty of Berlin of 1884-85 Scramble for Africa, 14 in number including the USA. Although there were no African representatives in the 104 days of the Berlin conferences in balkanizations of Africa by state signatories, and what was known as Abyssinia in the eyes of Europeans, and the warlords who emerged in the region, were considered and enabled to be the partitioners of the scramble for Africa singularly, rather than the victims of the scramble, as it was the case with the entire African continent in absentee. See more in depth in article entitled Anomaly in the Scramble for Africa. Abyssinian warlords enabled shareholders singularly out of Africa. Abyssinia Empire, or contemporary fake Ethiopia, can and does not exist without Europe at all. We challenge the notion of the only independent, even worse, the only black nation, the bastion of the liberation of anti-colonial struggles of the African nations and African descendants out of Africa. Indeed, this perception turned the wide propaganda machinery, while the historical evidence on the ground has proven diametrically the opposite. The Abyssinia Empire, or contemporary fake and stolen contemporary fake name Ethiopia, can and does not exist without European backing with all means and tools, and enabled to invade, conquer, occupy, establish, and maintain the predatory settler colonial empire of 6 to 10 times larger, richer and stronger people of the Cushitic, Omotic, and Nilotics of South than 𝗕𝗵𝗱 proper, Tigray and Amhara mainly, and yet incarcerated within the empire. The 𝗕𝗵𝗱𝗀, chieftains, bandits, warlords of rebels, juntas, etc. to the very date have been an obligate dependent on the European and their allies, like the USA, Russia, etc., since the Berlin Conference of 1884 to the very date. The mind of miseducated 𝗕𝗵𝗱s have been chameleonic, neither black nor white. We do not need extra radar to read the mind kookins of miseducated or semi-illiterate 𝗕𝗵𝗱s. These groups were adamantly known as the self-deniers, as Professor 𝗧𝗲 Jalata prophetically stated, being in and out of Africa, by reading the mind of the self-denier who installed in their brain the carbon copy of the concept of narratives of unique distinction, the notion of chosenness, claiming a unique position as the myth of deliberate invention of wish and whims. They carbon-copied the third-hand translation of the Greek version Christianity collection of 𝗕𝗏𝗱𝗁 folklores, began to be written by Hebrew author in exile, that gradually grown for centuries as snowball effect of the ideology of Zionism, the tool of empire building, the birth of the concept of the rule of tyranny, male chauvinism, personal dictator, what Professor Achille Mbembe coined and called necropolitices, the work of killing death. Such as the myth of an uninterrupted propaganda of owing 3,000 years of history, and a direct, continuous, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, king of kings of Ethiopia, out of vacuum. A case of the self-denier, 𝗕𝗲𝘡 renamed to 𝗕𝗲𝘆𝑎𝑐𝑖, whom did not know in his biological father for sure and a traitor indeed, who in 1931 proclaimed constitution for the first time father in written from. On 2 May 1936, 3 days before the Italians entered 𝗕𝗏𝘡, he fled to England to save his neck. He was brought back by the British in 1941 in the wake of the Allied victory of the Second World War against Italy. Once the British brought him back, 𝗕𝗲𝘆𝑎𝑐𝑖 propagated and institutionalized the plagiarism of the old collections of folklore of the Northwest Asian, Hebrew Christian people by the adoption of the Queen of Sheba narrative from a vacuum without shame in 1955. The fact has been, and there no grain of truth in the historical lens of her existence. Sheba, her birth to Menelik I, or his stolen object, the Ark of the Covenant, once he was grown enough to travel to Jerusalem, steal it, and carried to Axum, where it is still found. Even more laughable when one comes across the comedy, the intelligent 𝗕𝗲𝘆𝑎𝑐𝑖, nominal semi-illiterate 𝗕𝗵𝐴 priests play in front of the screen whenever this question is raised by some foreign adventurers to see the object. The whole ideology of jingoism has only one object. It served as an ideological justification for the conquest, annihilation, displacement, settlement, and subjugation of the non-𝗕𝗵𝐴 people, the existing indigenous peoples, of Cushitic-speaking groups who inhabited the region, followed by Nilotic and the Omotic people from time immemorial, and that holds to the very date. As perceived by certain groups, the notion of chosenness argues that its unscientific, unhistorical, and fundamentally irrational manifestations constitute a crucial proto-mindset for the development and extreme expression of fascism. While acknowledging the diverse and sometimes ethically grounded interpretations of choosiness in various cultures, this analysis focuses specifically on its perversion into an exclusionary, supremacist, and aggressive ideology. We contend that when chosenness transcends a sense of responsibility or unique cultural identity to embrace inherent, unchangeable superiority, it relies on fabricated historical narratives, pseudoscientific justifications, and illogical reasoning, thereby serving as a foundational psychological and ideological precursor to the authoritarian, expansionist, and genocidal tendencies inherent in fascism. This paper will deconstruct these problematic underpinnings, illustrating how the perception of choosiness, at its most virulent, culminates in the darkest expressions of collective delusion and institutionalized violence. The superficial markers like language or perceived genetic lineage, Oromo double helix, are sufficient to qualify him as an Oromo leader. Instead, we contend that his policies, which have systematically undermined Oromo self-determination, suppressed dissent, and centralized power away from ethnic federalism, demonstrate a fundamental disjunction from Oromo interests. The article posits that for Oromos to recognize Abiy Ahmed as Oromo, or Oromo leader, constitutes a profound act of self-insult, effectively validating a narrative that disregards their historical struggles and contemporary grievances, and thereby allowing his loyalists to claim a false legitimacy. We further explore how his strategic manipulation of Oromo symbols and the initial trust garnered from his background as a former OPDO, Oromo People's Democratic Organization, member, a working horse of TPLF for 28 years, served to neutralize potential Oromo political opposition, paralyzing leaders whom some Oromos had hoped would serve a transitional purpose. Ultimately, this analysis prioritizes the mind and deeds over performative identity markers in judging political authenticity and leadership within an ethno-national context. The enigma of Abiy Ahmed and contested Oromo identity. The rise of Abiy Ahmed to Ethiopia's premiership in 2018 was met with a complex blend of hope and skepticism, particularly within the Oromo community. Naively hailing him as 𝗕𝗲𝘆𝑎𝑐𝑖 Abaa Gada, the son of Abaa Gada, a misnomer, from the Oromia region, speaking Afan Oromo, and initially presenting himself as a champion of reform and Oromo rights. He quickly garnered significant international acclaim, culminating in the Nobel Peace Prize. Within Ethiopia, particularly among some Oromos, there was an initial surge of optimism that a son of the soil. Once part of the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, a party often seen as a working horse of 𝗕𝗵𝘆 for 28 years, might finally inaugurate an era of genuine Oromo empowerment and democratic transition. This hope was fueled by the Oromo 𝗕𝗶𝘆𝘆cie DNA identity rhetoric, an implicit or explicit appeal to shared heritage and ethnocultural belonging. However, a growing chorus of Oromo voices, particularly from nationalist and opposition factions, has vehemently rejected Abiy Ahmed's claim to Oromo leadership, and indeed, his very Oromo authenticity in a meaningful political sense. This article argues that such rejection is not merely political opposition, but stems from a deep-seated conviction that Abiy's actions and ideological underpinnings represent a fundamental betrayal of Oromo national identity and aspirations. The central premise is that those who continue to recognize Abiy Ahmed as Oromo, let alone an Oromo leader, are, in effect, inadvertently insulting themselves by validating the narratives of his loyalists, which obscure the profound harm his administration has inflicted upon the Oromo people. The article aims to move beyond a superficial understanding of ethnic identity, which often relies on primordial markers like language, birthplace, or assumed genetic lineage. Instead, it posits that for an ethnonational group, particularly one with a history of marginalization and struggle for self-determination, genuine leadership and authentic belonging are primarily defined by alignment with the group's collective interests, historical narratives, political aims, and sustained commitment to their liberation. It is what is in his mind and what he did against the Oromo people that ultimately qualifies or disqualifies him, rather than the garb he clad or the language he speaks. This analysis will proceed by first contextualizing the Oromo struggle and the significance of identity within it. Second, it will deconstruct the Oromo 𝗕𝗶𝘆𝘆cie rhetoric and examine how Abiy's initial appeal strategically paralyzed potential Oromo leaders and garnered trust. Third, it will meticulously detail the actions of Abiy Ahmed's government that are widely perceived by Oromos as antithetical to their interests and aspirations. Finally, it will argue why, from an Oromo nationalist perspective, recognizing Abiy as an Oromo leader profoundly contradicts the Oromo struggle for justice and self-determination, thereby constituting a form of self-insult. The Oromo struggle and the stakes of identity. The Oromo people, constituting the largest ethnonational group in the settler colonial empire of present-day Ethiopia that have a long and complex history marked by dispossession, cultural, Mohammed, 2016. 𝗕𝗲𝘶, 2006. For centuries, their identity has been contested, their language, Afan Oromo, suppressed, and their political agency systematically denied by successive Amhara-dominated regimes, and later by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, led EPRDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front coalition. This history has forged a robust Oromo ethno-nationalism, centered on the struggle for self-determination, the recognition of Oromo cultural and linguistic rights, and the pursuit of political autonomy, often encapsulated in the concept of Oromia, Oromo identity, culture, and nationhood. Within such a context, the question of leadership and authentic identity is not merely symbolic, it is existential. Leadership, particularly for a subaltern group, is inextricably linked to representation, advocacy, and advancement of the collective good. An Oromo leader is traditionally understood to champion Oromo rights, articulates their grievances, and actively works towards their liberation or greater autonomy. This understanding moves beyond a primordialist view of identity, which might simply accept shared ancestry or birthplace as sufficient. Instead, it leans towards a constructivist and performative understanding, where identity is not just inherited but continually performed, affirmed, and validated through action and commitment to group values. The Oromo 𝗕𝗶𝘆𝘆𝘆cie DNA identity rhetoric, often implicitly invoked by Abiy's early supporters, taps into a primordialist understanding of identity. It suggests that a shared genetic or ancestral link automatically confers authenticity and loyalty. However, this paper argues that such rhetoric is often a strategic essentialism, employed by external actors or co-opted elites to legitimize their rule, rather than reflecting the lived political reality of the group. For the Oromo, given their historical experience, authenticity in leadership is not merely a matter of biological lineage or linguistic fluency, but critically, one of political allegiance and demonstrable commitment to the Oromo cause. Betrayal, in this paradigm, is not just a personal failing, but a profound political act that severs the bond of shared identity. The lure of the Oromo double helix, strategic maneuvers and paralyzed hopes. Abiy Ahmed's ascension was facilitated by a wave of Oromo protest, the 𝗕𝗲𝘀𝘀𝗶𝗵 movement, and a strategic shift within the ruling EPRDF coalition. His Oromo background, fluency in Afaan Oromo, and his past as a key figure within the OPDO initially positioned him as a potential savior, or, at the very least, a significant transitional figure for the Oromo people. The narrative that an Oromo was finally at the helm of the Ethiopian state resonated deeply with many, invoking the double helix of shared identity as a promise of solidarity and understanding. This initial appeal was highly effective in disarming and paralyzing his nearest party leader, whom some Oromos trusted out of PDOs. Many Oromos, disillusioned after 28 years solid of TPLF-dominated rule and the OPDO's subservient role, genuinely hoped he may serve as a transition. Figures within the Oromo Democratic Party, ODP, formerly OPDO, and even some Oromo nationalist opposition figures initially gave Abiy the benefit of the doubt, believing his Oromo heritage would dictate a policy shift favoring Oromo rights. His rhetoric of unity, forgiveness, and pan-Ethiopian identity, while appealing to some, was simultaneously couched in language that paid homage to Oromo suffering and promised redress. The strategic deployment of Oromo symbols and language, coupled with his background, created a powerful illusion of genuine representation. This illusion was crucial in consolidating his power, marginalizing internal Oromo dissent within the ruling party, and temporarily placating the broader Oromo nationalist movement. The hope was that his Oromo identity would naturally lead to policies that dismantle the structural inequities faced by Oromos and foster self-determination within the federal framework. However, this hope, as events unfolded, proved to be profoundly misplaced. From perceived ally to perceived adversary, Abiy Ahmed's actions against the Oromo people. The disillusionment with Abiy Ahmed among Oromo nationalists stems directly from his government's actions, which are widely perceived as antithetical to Oromo interests and aspirations. These actions, rather than any superficial genetic or linguistic markers, form the basis for the argument that he is not an Oromo leader in any meaningful sense. Centralization of power and dismantling of ethnic federalism. Abiy Ahmed's flagship political project, the formation of the Prosperity Party, PP, from the EPRDF coalition, was seen by many Oromos as a direct assault on the principle of ethnic federalism, which, despite its flaws, provided a framework for group rights and limited regional autonomy. The PP's ideological emphasis on a unitary, fake Ethiopia identity, often termed 𝗕𝗲𝘃, was interpreted as a move to dilute Oromo distinctiveness and assimilate Oromia into a centralized state structure, reminiscent of historical 𝗕𝗲𝘃 imperial rule, an act of genocidal and ethnocidal fascistic enterprise within the empire. This shift undermined the very constitutional guarantees of self-administration that Oromo nationalists had long fought for. Suppression, killing of Oromo political dissent, artists, Abaa Gadas, etc. Despite initial promises of opening up political space, Abiy's government has presided over a severe crackdown on Oromo political opposition, such as the members of the Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, who were initially welcomed back but subsequently arrested, detained, and their party's activities significantly curtailed. Civil society. The Oromo Federalist Congress, OFC, and its corresponding leaders, members, supporters, etc. This suppression extended to grassroots activists, journalists, and media outlets, many of whom faced arbitrary arrests, imprisonment, and violence. The widespread and prolonged internet shutdowns in Oromia further stifled communication and organized dissent, effectively paralyzing any independent Oromo political voice. Targeting and eliminating prominent Oromo voices, which critics and human rights organizations increasingly attribute to a deliberate state policy under Abiy Ahmed's command. Artists, Abaa Gadas, traditional leaders, lawyers, organic intellectuals, and religious figures, individuals who serve as the conscience, cultural custodians, and intellectual backbone of the Oromo community killed, arrested, suffered in prolonged detentions, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. This strategy has been designed to silence dissent, dismantle indigenous leadership structures, and suppress Oromo political and cultural expression, thereby consolidating central government control through intimidation. The resulting climate of fear and insecurity not only stifles freedom of speech and assembly, but also systematically erodes the social fabric and institutional memory of the Oromo people, with profound and lasting implications for peace and stability in the wider Horn of Africa. Military campaigns and human rights abuses in Oromia. The most damning evidence against Abiy's claim to Oromo leadership comes from the severe military operations launched in Oromia, particularly against the Oromo Liberation Army, OLA, a continuation of the 𝗕𝗵𝘆cie_PRDF wipe-out policies for 3 decades. These campaigns have resulted in widespread human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians, and collective punishment of communities perceived to support the OLA. For many Oromos, the deployment of federal forces, often acting with impunity, against their own people fundamentally negates any claim of shared identity or leadership. A leader, particularly an Oromo leader, is expected to protect their people, not oversee their persecution. Economic marginalization and land politics. While economic development is a stated goal, critics argue that Abiy's policies continue to facilitate land dispossession for large-scale development projects, particularly around the capital 𝗕𝗏𝗀. This issue has historically been a flashpoint for Oromo grievances, as it often leads to the displacement of Oromo farmers without adequate compensation and benefits for non-Oromo elites. The lack of genuine Oromo agency in these development decisions further fuels the narrative of internal colonialism, where Oromia's resources are exploited for the benefit of the central state and other groups. Ideological reframing and denial of historical grievances. Abiy's Medimur delusional dream to reverse one of the most backward settler colonial of Abyssinian under his stewardship, whose tenure is increasingly seen not as a rejuvenation, but a turn back to the 19th century genocidal era as the final, agonizing chapter of a dying empire. Thus, he initially fabricated internal conflicts, ethnic polarization, and a perilous economic decline as the best political manipulations for his survival, and to cling to power as all of his predecessors since the conception of the empire in its current form, except the secession of Eritrea in 1991. Today, the dying empire is found at the tail ends of the Human Development Index and the Global Innovation Index. Hunger and malnutrition leave millions without sufficient nutritious food to survive, independent of societal status and profession, and level of qualification. As a consequence, the WFP warns that more than 10 million people are facing hunger and malnutrition, including 3 million people forced from their homes. Alarmingly high malnutrition rates, with 4.4 million pregnant and breastfeeding women and children in need of treatment. The current population is more than 130 million, with some 90 cultural identities conquered by European weapons, mentorship, brains, finance, and global political recognition and support from the world stage, and the human labor of the 𝗕𝗵𝗆cie, the gun-carrying fanatics, the empty-stomach killer hordes, the dogs of war since the mid-19th century. As a result, the entire current population incarcerated in the colonial settler-colonial empires. Open prisons was rounded up with the same violence that is still being used today. By emphasizing a singular Ethiopian identity, it implicitly sidelines the legitimate grievances rooted in ethnic oppression and cultural suppression. This ideological stance, from an Oromo nationalist perspective, represents a direct affront to the Oromo struggle for historical recognition and justice. These actions, taken together, demonstrate a profound divergence between Abiy Ahmed's governance, an assimilate mental hybrid core dream, and the great Oromo nation's centuries of resistance and struggle for freedom and liberty of the Oromo people and Oromia, and the entire colonized people of the Horn of Africa incarcerated in the Abyssinian Empire for over centuries. So far, his primary loyalty appears to be to a centralized, camouflaged, unitary Ethiopian state, which never existed in reality. But it has been a Euro-Amharized settler colonial empire that established a predatory-prey interrelationship with the colonized people and the land, resources, and labor. She is the burden of the people with the stolen name Ethiopia, translated from Kush. The prompt's assertion that Abiy Ahmed's Oromo 𝗕𝗲𝘆𝐴 DNA identity rhetoric, his former OPDO affiliation, the garb he clad, or the language he speaks are insufficient markers of genuine Oromo identity or leadership is central to this analysis. This perspective argues for a performative and ethical understanding of identity, particularly critical in contexts of protracted struggle. For the Oromo, identity is not merely a biological or linguistic fact. It is a political commitment, a shared historical consciousness, and an active participation in the collective struggle for Oromo. When a leader, despite their ethnic background, actively implements policies that systematically oppress, disempower, and marginalize their ostensible community, their claim to that identity, especially in a leadership capacity, becomes fundamentally illegitimate. It is precisely what is in his mind and what he did against the Oromo people that qualifies him as an adversary, not a leader, from this critical Oromo perspective. To continue to call Abiy Ahmed the Oromo nation in the political or managerial sense, after witnessing documented human rights violations, political repression, and ideological shifts initiated under his rule, is therefore deeply insulting to the Oromo nation. To continue to call Abiy Ahmed as Oromoo, iIlmaa Abaa Gada, in a political or leadership sense, after witnessing the documented human rights abuses, political repression, and ideological shifts initiated under his tenure, is therefore understood as a profound, insulting themselves, a fraud of Gada, as system and the Oromo nation of Gada. All dictators that the Oromo people has destined to witness at least since the Menelik's 𝗕𝗲𝘅 policies, 𝗕𝗲𝘅cie 𝗱 policy, dirges, socialism, and the nominal federalism of the TPLF's eras of tyrannical one-man Stalinist rules more than Stalin himself, and the contemporary recruit of TPLF, Abiy's Prosperity Party, founded and operated on the policies of elimination, settler colonial genocides and ethnicides, all in one democide. Ecocides of the entire South, and the matings of the status quo of the established predatory settler colonial Abyssinian Empire, know with a stolen fake trade name, Ethiopia, contemporary. Validates state propaganda. It inadvertently lends credibility to the state's narrative that Abiy represents the Oromo, thereby masking the deep antagonism felt by a significant portion of the community. It allows his loyal servants to claim a false Oromo legitimacy for actions profoundly detrimental to Oromos. Undermines the Oromo struggle. It blurs the lines between genuine Oromo leadership, committed to self-determination, and those perceived as co-opted agents of a centralizing state. This weakens the moral and political clarity of the Oromo nationalist movement. Normalizes betrayal. It implies that ethnicity is an immutable quality that overrides political actions, effectively whitewashing the perceived betrayal of Oromo interests. This sets a dangerous precedent, suggesting that as long as a leader shares superficial traits, their destructive actions can be overlooked. Disregards Oromo suffering. It dismisses the lived experiences of hundreds of thousands of Oromos who have suffered under his administration, turning a blind eye to the very real violence and repression they face at the hands of a government led by someone claiming Oromo heritage. In this light, the argument is that political leadership, especially within an ethno-national liberation context, is an earned status predicated on actions, loyalty to the group's cause, and commitment to its collective well-being. Abiy Ahmed's tenure has, from that perspective, been a consistent pattern of prioritizing 𝗕𝗲𝘆cie settler colonial structural of the predatory empire since her inventions. The mythical and politically unitary Ethiopian state narrative that exists only in his and his cohesive circles of the residues of the offspring of settlers, 𝗕𝗵𝗱's mind, of one of the most backward Abyssinia settler colonial predatory structural empire called the 𝗕𝗲𝘆cie system. They have been collection of conglomeration of descendants of 𝗕𝗵𝗱 settlers from within the empire and refugees from abroad who had chosen to join the regime of one of the most backward and predatory settler colonial empires, the 𝗕𝗲𝘆cie system, the burden of the entire South. In his delusional ideological mind, strategic objectives, if at all if he has one, and deeds, policies, military actions, are fundamentally not only anti-Oromo, and historically based aspiration of the Oromo people centuries of struggles of liberalizations and sacrifice from backward, settler colonial genocidal empires. An existential treat to the great and ancient Oromo nation of Africa, regardless of his birth certificate or linguistic fluency. The politics of naming and the future of Oromo identity. The debate surrounding Abiy Ahmed's Oromo identity and leadership is more than a semantic dispute. It is a critical engagement with the nature of political authenticity, ethnic identity, and the meaning of leadership in a multi-ethnic state struggling with issues of self-determination. This article has argued that for a significant segment of the Oromo people, particularly Oromo nationalists, Abiy Ahmed's actions during his premiership have rendered any claim of genuine Oromo leadership, or even authentic Oromo identity in a politically meaningful sense, null and void. His strategic use of Oromo double helix, DNA identity rhetoric, effectively only when it profited him and his initial background as an OPDO, a working horse of TPLF for 28 years. For instances creating a brief window of false hope for a transition that ultimately proved detrimental to Oromo aspirations, whom some Oromos trusted him. A fatal erratum to regret the most after short period of honeymoon and euphoria. He's systematically dismantling ethnic federalism, brutally suppressing Oromo political dissent, overseeing extensive human rights abuses in Oromia, and promoting a centralized Ethiopianist ideology. Abiy Ahmed has, in the eyes of many Oromos, positioned himself as an adversary rather than a representative even worse than the half-devils and half-𝗕𝗵𝗱 of the 19th centuries. To recognize him as an Oromo leader, under these circumstances, is not merely a political difference of opinion, but, as argued, a profound act of self-insult, undermining the Oromo struggle, validating his government's repressive narratives, and collectively diminishing the integrity of Oromo. The case of Abiy Ahmed underscores a crucial aspect of identity politics, that in contexts of historical subjugation, genuine identity, especially in leadership, transcends superficial markers like ethnicity or language. It is forged in the crucible of shared struggle, loyalty to collective aspirations, and demonstrable commitment to the people's well-being. The mind and deeds of a leader, when measured against the long-standing and deeply felt grievances of a marginalized community, become the ultimate arbiter of authenticity and legitimacy. The ongoing controversy over Abiy Ahmed's identity serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of Oromo nationalism and its refusal to allow performative identity to mask what is perceived as profound political betrayal. The future of Oromo identity and the broader world will continue to be shaped by how these deeply ingrained and contested narratives are navigated. Oromia. The essence of Oromoness, as profoundly articulated through the enduring principles of the Gada system, transcends superficial markers of identity. It is a worldview that deliberately shifts focus away from biological lineage or linguistic fluency as primary determinants of worth or belonging. Indeed, one's double helix, or the tongue they speak, while often indicative of heritage, does not inherently confer respect or status within the Oromo of Gada people and society. Instead, true credit and recognition are rigorously earned through the cultivation of one's mind, encompassing wisdom, integrity, sound judgment, and a deep understanding of justice, and through one's deeds, referring to actions that demonstrate courage, service, responsibility, and unwavering commitment to the collective well-being known as 𝗕𝗲liche like Geist in German language, one among the 3 pillars of Oromo, the invisible one as software in computer. 𝗕𝗲liche is the second one that literally means Mother Nature, human beings as part of it, not as master of it. Third, 𝗕𝗲cie, moral and ethical conduct, where 𝗕𝗲, law, 𝗕𝗲, rules, are universal, are made and regulate the entire relationships and managements are fostered by a meritocratic society where respect is garnered through demo. It encompasses the respect for it as it is living and non-living things and their role. The Gada system, as a holistic socio-political and spiritual framework, meticulously evaluates individuals not by their birthright, but by their active contribution to community welfare, their capacity for ethical leadership, and their adherence to the 3 pillars of Oromo wisdom, effective problem-solving, and a life dedicated to upholding communal values. As a result, that an individual, regardless of their lineage or fluency in Afan Oromo, who embodies Nagya peace, Jalala love, Takama unity, and Waluma cooperation through their thoughts and actions, truly embodies Oromoness. Therefore, to be Oromo is not merely an accident of birth. It is a continuous commitment, an active philosophical engagement that demands self-reflection, ethical conduct, and tangible contributions to society. It is an identity forged in intelligence and benevolence, proving that true belonging is not inherited, but profoundly lived and earned. In the Oromo world, the ancient nation of Africa cradle of Gada system, one of the most complex systems of social organizations ever devised by the human imagination. The pioneer of the Gada system, the master teacher and researcher, and the author of Gada, 3 approaches to the study of Africa society and Oromo democracy. An indigenous African political system, Professor 𝗕𝗲𝘕𝗻 described. The term Gada cannot be given a univocal interpretation. It stands for several related ideas. It is, first of all, the concept standing for the way of life. The Gada system is an institution that represents an extreme development of a type of social structure based on age sets. It is an elaborated, well-structured system for distributing power among all generational segments of society. All generations enjoy different kinds of power at different stages of the life course. Oromo democracy is one of those remarkable creations of the human mind that evolved into a full-fledged system of government, as a result of 5 centuries of evolution and deliberate, rational, legislative transformation. It contains genuinely African solutions for some of the problems that democracies everywhere have had to face. Furthermore, Prof. Asafa Jalata, an author of 8 books and over 60 research publications, said, "I have studied the history of the world society, African, European, African American, Oromo, etc., and I have never seen a system that can be compared to 𝗕𝗲𝘀𝘀𝗀𝗃, the 𝗕𝗲_psych system, its complexity, mechanisms of check and balance of power, a civilization that can be able to be the model for the rest of the world, suffering from the so-called Western democracy of party lines in the 21st century. Most importantly, the flag anthem-dependent, quasi-African states. The master teacher and the author of sacred knowledge tradition of the Oromo of the Horn of Africa, Dr. 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝘃 and Anissa Kassem stated, "By defining Gada, we take the Oromo Gada system to be a collective, democratic, and egalitarian mode of government of ancient provenance through assemblies, 𝗕𝗲, 𝗕𝗄𝗄, that operated at different levels of the social-political structure. The corporate role of this deliberative assembly was to uphold and implement the traditional customs and laws 𝗓𝗓 that formed part of the collectively agreed-upon oral constitution. The Oromo refer to this form of government through assembly as 𝗕𝗲𝘃𝗀𝘃, government from within, and 𝗕𝗲𝗃𝗲𝗃, government for above. The assembly government was a historical outcome of a series of conscious undertaken structural reforms implemented in response to internal and external historical changes, social, economical, demographic, and the political circumstance. It was through the institutionalized structure of nested assemblies social, economic, political, judicial, military, and religious functions of government were carried out. It was also through these assemblies that the communal resources were managed, defended, enlarged, and celebrated, through which relations with the external trading partners were regulated. Gada underpinned all the traditional modes of production of the Oromo, their social network of exchange, welfare system, political economy. The component temporarily units of Gada served as a mechanism for recording social, political, environmental, and historical change, and for predicting in the future. It was the primary institutional channel through which cultural knowledge was transmitted. Conclusion. At the heart of Oromoness, deeply rooted in the principles of the Gada system, lies an unwavering commitment to substance over superficiality. It recognizes that true worth is not found in genetic markers, like a double helix, nor in transient expressions, but rather in the depth of one's mind and the integrity of their deeds. This ancient democratic governance model of Gada prioritizes wisdom, character, and genuine contribution to the community as the sole determinants of leadership and respect. Leaders are judged not by their lineage or outward appearance, but by their capacity for sagacious thought, ethical conduct, and unwavering commitment to the well-being of the collective. Abiy's 𝗕𝗲𝘃, prosperity party, delusional dream to reverse one of the most backward settler colonial of Abyssinian under his stewardship, whose tenure is increasingly seen not as a rejuvenation, but a turn back to the 19th century genocidal era as the final, agonizing chapter of a dying empire. A good news, a death from within. Once hailed as a dynamic reformer, Abiy Ahmed's trajectory has been critically redefined by his actions as an attempt to revive a settler colonial Abyssinian project under the guise of national unity. This perspective posits that his vision, centered on a strong, centralized state and a unified Ethiopian identity, implicitly marginalized or sought to subsume the distinct ethno-linguistic identities of the country's diverse regions, echoing historical patterns of imperial expansion and homogenization. As he consolidated power, sidelining opposition, and dissolving the previous federal coalition in favor of his prosperity party, the promise of democratic reform gave way to an increasingly autocratic one-man rule. However, it was precisely this internal consolidation and the forceful suppression of dissent, most notably culminating in the devastating war in Tigray and subsequent conflicts in Amhara and Oromia, that led the project to die from within. The very attempt to impose a singular national narrative, a classic settler colonial endeavor, was, though cloaked in the rhetoric of progress and development, alienated large segments of the population, fueled widespread resistance, and shattered the fragile social contract. Demonstrating that any attempt to forge unity through coercion and the perceived reassertion of a historically dominant identity was inherently unsustainable and ultimately doomed to unravel under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the fierce opposition it provoked. The resurrection of settler colonial dream of Abiy, devoid of genuine connection, simply withered and collapsed from its own inherent contradictions. Consequently, under a faithfully functioning Gada framework, a figure like Abiy Ahmed, whose tenure has been marred by allegations of widespread crimes and destructive policies, would have been identified and thoroughly scrutinized much earlier. His actions, deemed antithetical to the very essence of communal harmony, justice, and accountability prized by Gada, would have led to his swift ostracism, fundamentally preventing his ascent to higher office and thereby averting the catastrophic 7 years of alleged misrule and profound suffering he is accused of inflicting upon the nation. As the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, empires, large or small, rich or poor, created by invade, conquerors, colonizers who conducted genocide and ethnocide had fallen apart, and shall fall apart independent of time and place. That is what history teaches to those who are in a position to learn from it. Thus, it is not a question of how, but when that one of the poorest predatory barbarian half a devil and half a 𝗕𝗵𝗱𝗁 outlaw local chieftains, Amhara and Tigray mainly, armed to their teeth by European colonizers during the scramble for Africa as an extension of the European colonial project maintained to the very date shall fall apart.